Hey, this is the spoiler review section for To Green Angel Tower. I really wanted to talk about some of the spoilers in this book, and I have more notes on it, so if you haven't seen the first part, maybe check it out. Or if you just want to hear some spoiler discussion around this great book, just stay locked here and listen in. Alright, so one of the first things I have here is that so much of this series revolves around misinformation. A lot of the stuff that has happened is really just down to people not really knowing what's going on. And even with Simon, you kind of see this start to happen around him. People think that he slayed a dragon, where he knows he really just fought a dragon off, he didn't kill it, and how these things grow into be larger than life and just become accepted as fact. One of the really big ones here is all around King Prester John. So many people believe that Prester John, the king before, who's passed away now, was just this legendary, awesome figure who slayed a dragon under the Hayholt, who found the sword Brightnail, and just became this figure of legend, really, that nobody could ever stand up to. And this really is kind of what pushes Elias into madness. He doesn't feel like he can live up to his father's legacy. No matter what you are, you're just going to be a shadow compared to Prester John, no matter who you are. And this leads Elias to taking really drastic measures and becoming the Mad King that he does, because how can he surpass John? He really can't. And, when it comes down to it, as we find out through reading this book, John's whole legend is a lie. So what really happened is that Prester John, before he was king, went down under the Hayholt to look for the dragon Shurikai. I believe that's the name of the dragon. And what he comes to find is that the dragon was slain. It was already killed. And the one that killed it, I believe, was the prior king, actually, which, another big spoiler, is Simon's descended from that. And there, too, I think it was in the dragon or right around there, was Memory, the sword Memory. I think it's Mimiar, or I don't remember the real name for the sword, but John has the sword reforged into Brightnail to kind of hide its true heritage, and claims that he killed the dragon himself. So he starts building up this lie around himself to bring himself up into kinghood. And I believe John is just a peasant or a lower class knight at the time. He really doesn't have any claim to the throne whatsoever or any high noble status. So this action alone basically catapults him from wherever he's at all the way to the top. And of course, I mean, think about it. If that was you, you are basically just the king of like all the lands now, the high king. You'd probably want that. Basically anybody would want that. So yes, he's going to build this lie around it. And so much bloodshed happens in the name of this lie. John drove like the Scythy out of the lands, and Kamaris was with him fighting through some of these battles. And really, it's because the Scythy know more about what actually happened. They know that John isn't the one that killed Shurikai, and John wants to just drive all this out so no potential truth could come about of what he actually did, and that his whole kingship is built on a lie. So I thought that was just so interesting, and at the end there, I was really tying Elias to it, and how it's really tragic that Elias is also kind of obviously for his wife who passed away and wanting to reach her, but it really felt like to me that it was talking so much about how Elias just he didn't feel like there was any possible way he could live up to what his father has done, even though his father didn't actually really do any of it, but took the credit for it. Another kind of one of these lies and bits of misinformation that we had been warned about for a lot of the series was the false messenger. I forget the name of Simon's teacher that Priorities killed, but one of the scroll bearers, Simon's teacher, told him all the way back in the first book after he passed away, beware the false messenger. And this has been hammered into us again and again and again. And what it ultimately ended up being was that the Dream Road is not totally reliable. There's just a lot of Inaluki's kind of presence there, or Utuku. They have this very powerful presence in the Dream Road, and they can kind of corrupt the messages that are happening there. And the message that Simon received in the Dream Road that really drove so much of the plot for these 3 books was that the 3 swords are going to be the tool that will really help kind of put an end to the Storm King and be the salvation for the people. And that was the false message. The false messengers were on the Dream Road, and the false message was about these swords. It was really that these swords, they wanted these swords to be drawn together. And these swords have such a great mythical, crazy, quality, magical quality about them, otherworldly quality about them, and how they will just draw themselves together. Priorities really wasn't ever afraid of these swords, having to go find them, because he knew the swords will bring them to here when the time is right. And it did happen there at the very end of the book. Kamaris bringing Thorn, Simon bringing Miniar, and then Elias having Sorrow for basically the entire trilogy. So now let's go to another one of these lies, and this one I did see coming, and I'll talk about how I saw it coming, and this is that Kamaris is actually Joshua's father. For this whole time, people have thought that, Joshua and Elias are brothers. They both have the same mother. They're both from the High King. So yes, they do both have the same mother, but a lot of this had been talking about how, throughout the whole series, how Kamaris was Prester John's wife's special protector. And there seemed to be an interesting relationship there. And this really does, too, kind of happen to the next generation, where Elias, his wife, Joshua was in love with her, and Joshua was the one that was protecting her. So it's kind of two generations of that. And I actually thought that Miriamel was going to end up being Joshua's daughter, too. That wasn't true. She was Elias's daughter, and that did work ultimately better for the plot in the end there. But Kamaris is Joshua's father, and you don't get this revealed to the very, very, very last chapters of the book. But I think it's painted pretty clearly that this is a thing. Kamaris has this heavy burden on his shoulders once he regains his sanity, and that I'll get to later, one of my favorite parts of the book. Once he regains his sanity, he's just got this heavy burden, this sin lying on his shoulders, and he tells one of the priests, one of the fathers, who's also a scroll bearer, and that's kind of holy. He can't tell anybody else what he told him. But Kamaris does break down and tells Joshua, and Joshua's whole demeanor around Kamaris changes, and people start to notice that there's a very strange interaction between these two after that moment. And that's definitely making it pretty clear that they have an interesting relationship, that Kamaris is his father. But the moment that actually got me was way before this, and before even that Kamaris regained his full mental sanity. It was when they were in the swamps, and Miriamel was with Kamaris, kind of interacting with him for the first time. She looked at Kamaris, and she said that he looked very familiar to somebody that she knew, and she couldn't quite put her finger on it. And I kind of just knew at that moment that Kamaris has got to be Joshua's father. There were enough qualities between the two of them that I could just make it that relationship before it was more explicitly shown to us and then ultimately revealed. So I really like how that was constructed and built up. And like I said, I really like these two relationship where they have kind of two generations of this longing after someone they can't have. And with Kamaris, it turns out that he did have the son, but with Joshua, I don't think there was anything that really happened there between him and Elias's wife. He just loved her too. Ultimately, he has Vorsheva now and his own twins to care for. So now let's go to one of the other big reveals that happens, is that we get Simon's lineage. Simon, he's a kitchen scullion, and he ends up being king at the very end of the book here. And I kind of knew this because I knew that Simon was going to be king because I read some of the back of the books for the later books, which I didn't. So I knew what Simon ultimately was going to end up as, but I was wondering how he was going to get there. And I'm glad that he wasn't like a secret son of Prester John or something like that, especially because he ends up marrying Miriamel. That would have been weird. Definitely Game of Thrones vibes there if that would have happened. But it turns out that Simon's a descendant from the real bloodline of the king from before, the one that slayed the dragon. Lilith, who's kind of in between life and death, kind of leads Simon down these facts, leading him to the truth of his heritage. And it's really good. I like how this all worked out, and I'm totally fine with him being like a descendant like this. I think it works better, like I said, than him being related to John in any sort of way. Now I want to touch on some of the character deaths that happen here. There's quite a few major character deaths for POV characters that we have. The first one that kind of hit, that was definitely a bummer, was Deonorth, Joshua's like right-hand man. Deonorth gets off-screened. You don't follow him, and they find his body later, and it just breaks Joshua. And that was a bummer, because Deonorth was really, he held Joshua together so much throughout this entire trilogy of books. So it was sad seeing him get killed, but, it was one of the realities of conflict here. Some of the other major ones are Guthwolf, the king's right-hand man for most of the series. Guthwolf had gone insane, and really ultimately his purpose was to he gets Brightnail, and then once Simon gets a hold of the sword, Guthwolf passes away. And I actually liked this too. I liked Guthwolf quite a bit as a character, but really his purpose was the sword's will. The sword was trying to will itself back to where it needed to go to, and through Guthwolf, it almost willed itself into Simon's hands. So Guthwolf was really an instrument or a tool of the sword to get to where it really wanted to go. And Guthwolf, too, saved Simon's life when Simon's being tortured on the wheel there for quite some time. And I was surprised the level of kind of pain and torture that Simon goes through throughout this book. So another major character death that we get here is Maegwyn. Maegwyn has basically lost her marbles in this book. Kind of happens at the end of the last book too, where she's just really thinking that she can hear the gods. And then she gets dealt a pretty significant blow to the head here, and she thinks that she's passed away and is in heaven now. I did like the relationship between Eolair and Maegwyn, and really Maegwyn kind of just being lost, not knowing what's reality and what is. But ultimately, Maegwyn kind of served a similar purpose as Guthwolf, where she was really an instrument to guide Simon in the end. I wish there was a little bit more there, but really her purpose as a character is to push Simon back from dying. These two characters are very far apart, but they've been able to communicate since, I believe, the second book. And what happens is that Maegwyn is dying, Simon's dying, he's being tortured to death, and they meet each other in basically it's not even the dream road, it's like beyond the dream road. And Simon helps Maegwyn regain her sanity and identity and recognizing her wrongs, and she is just so thankful for Simon, and now that she has everything back together, she just asks Simon to tell Eolair that she really loved him. And she gives Simon basically her life power. There's an artifact from the Dweros that she has, and she's able to use it to push Simon back to life, able to will him back to life at the cost of her own life. So that was nice, and I like that, Maegwyn was able to interact with the larger cast, because really she's just been interacting with Eolair and not a lot of other characters. She does get to interact with the Duke's son a bit, but really, like I said, she's been her own POV character out here on her own. But she did do some good stuff for her kingdom, not really intentionally. So yeah, like I said, Maegwyn really just felt like a means to saving Simon's life there, but some pretty good interaction between the two. One other death was Velada Jalowi's death. I thought she was going to be around for longer, maybe even to the next series. So didn't fully expect Jalowi to pass away, but ultimately, things happen, and Jalowi got taken out there. So they were trying to get Kamaris and got Jalowi instead. I was afraid that maybe Tiamak or somebody was going to die, but our witch went away, and I think it's good because it kind of puts the whole party into a more precarious situation, because Jalowi is such an ancient and well-known figure that it really makes them struggle more without having her presence there. And then very near the end of the book, one of the deaths that almost got me, that ultimately didn't end up being a death, was Joshua. I thought he was just dead, because Elias strikes him, and you think he strikes him on the neck and kills him. And ultimately, I'm glad that Joshua didn't die. He had worked so hard, and after he found out that he wasn't the king's son, it's like, man, this guy grinded so hard for his entire nation, and he's not even really of royal blood or anything. He's just out there working, and he never wanted to be this leader or anything, but he was just forced into this position. And I think he ended up being a very good leader. I mean, he did a lot of great things for the whole nation. And I like how it's kind of poetic too, that throughout this entire time, Joshua was chained up in the first book by Pirates and his brother. And one of the things he's kept the whole time is that on his right hand, I believe it is, or his right or his left. Actually, I think it's his left hand. He's kept the handcuff on there the whole time since he's been locked up. And that's ultimately what ends up saving his life, because he's able to use that handcuff to block the sword from decapitating him. So that was awesome. And I'm really glad that at the end there, he sneaks back into the tent and sees Simon and Miriamel, and he says, hey, I'm alive. Don't tell anybody. Here's my heritage. I'm Kamaris' son, and I want out of this. I just need to be with my wife and my new kids. He really kind of finds a new purpose in life once his kids are born, and he seems happier than ever, and something to really live for and fight for. Because all this, he's been forced into this role of leadership, but now he's found what he really cares for. So I'm really glad that Joshua got a happy ending out at the end there. Another part of the book I really want to talk about was the Gants. Man, those things were crazy, and I hope we get to explore them more in the future books. But those crazy bugs and all the weird things going on there, and like how much of the people of the swamp people they end up actually getting. They were using them to communicate with Utuku or some other dark power. That was the most haunting thing in this entire trilogy. And I really wasn't expecting it. So I definitely hope we get to explore more of that and some more crazy creatures. One of the other things, my probably favorite lore part of this entire series, has been the Navigator's Children, also called the Tanukadea, and how they can change. So there's the races of the Gardenborn. We have the Scythi, we have the Norns, which these are kind of the same family that split off quite a ways ago in time. But the Tanukadea are kind of like their servants. They're also Gardenborn, and they are able to change. They're changelings. And they change. It takes them quite a while to change, but they adapt to their environments. It turns out Jaloe is one of these. I kind of figured with the way that she had been described that she'd be one in the end. The Dweros which are kind of like the deep elves or the deep Scythi, the ones that live underground. And actually Miriamel spends quite a bit of time with them there at a certain point in the book when things are looking pretty bad. The Niskis, which are the singers on the boats that protect against the, I forget the name of the sea creatures, but these kind of sea monsters that want to eat people. The Niskis sing and keep them away from the boats. So all of that was really interesting to see how this one race of peoples has been so diversely modified to live in different environments. And I really want more of their lore. And so much too, they are like the greatest smiths of all the land. The swords, I think every sword was forged by them, if I'm not mistaken. Miniar was definitely forged by them. I think Thorn was definitely forged by them. And I think Sorrow, their smithing techniques were taught to Inaluki, who forged Sorrow. But they feel responsible for that as well. I could be wrong. But basically, they have these words of shaping. And these swords are they're like breaking the laws of reality and the physics of reality. But they've been able to be bound that way because of these words of the Tanukadea know. So really loved all of that. Really loved the lore and the magic around the swords and how they ultimately kind of went away at the end. But who knows what happened to Kamaris or Thorn. They kind of leaves that unknown. But Miniar and Sorrow are gone. I also want to talk about Miriamel a bit here. Obviously a major character. And I feel like in the non-spoiler part, it was really hard to talk about her. She's a strong character. She goes through a lot. She goes through some really rough stuff kind of near the end of the Stone of Farewell and the beginning of this book with, I forget the name of the ship's captain, but he does stuff to her and he takes advantage of her. He knows more than he's letting on, and it puts her in a bad position that makes her feel really bad about herself. But she grows and she's pretty headstrong. She tries to go and talk to Elias. She really thinks this whole thing's about her mother and Elias and how he's trying to reach her mother on the other side. And he is kind of very distraught over that situation. And I really like how it ends up being Miriamel is the one that gets the final blow. So I'll kind of talk about the very end of the book here now, where it turns out that Priorities did want these swords to come together. Utuku did too, and so did Inaluki. Through these three swords meeting together, it allowed Inaluki to come back from beyond death and manifest himself into the king, King Elias. And I really like how you could tell Elias was just going insane. Things were happening to him. He was changing. He was becoming this vessel for Inaluki to inhabit. And that's what happens at the end of the book here. And then Priorities plays his hand a little too early, and he's a schemer. He thinks that he can use these certain magics to basically bound Inaluki to his will. He says that all the lands will fear, Inaluki, all the peoples will fear Inaluki, but you will be under my control, under my guidance. He thinks he can control him. And that does not go his way. Basically, his spell doesn't work, and Inaluki just destroys him. And I like how they write how Inaluki is kind of this just like crazy Elias transforms into this figure of like almost like black smoke that's like changing shapes and stuff. It's not like he just turned into a Scythe or something, or Norn, like something like that. He's this kind of more crazy figure. And really, we only get like 1 or 2 chapters with Inaluki actually manifesting back into reality here for the final conflict. And through some conversation and stuff, ultimately Elias is able to expose himself again. The vessel is able to expose himself, and Miriamel shoots Simon's white arrow, and it pierces and it kills Elias. She has to be strong enough to be able to accept that that's what needed to be done. And it seemed like Elias did want her. He finally realized, man, I have made some serious mistakes here, and he wants Miriamel to take him out. And she does, and that ultimately severs Inaluki's connection to this world. As it's being severed, Inaluki's trying to either grab onto Simon or Kamaris. And Kamaris is so pious that it's not an option. And Simon is ultimately able to let go of his hatred. Really, that hatred was building in Simon so much, especially when he's being tortured. And he ultimately centers the hatred. It kind of spreads out. He hates like Jocelyn, all these people, and blames them. Then he focuses his hatred more on Inaluki. And then he's able to let go of his hatred because I'm trying to remember exactly what happens, but ultimately he doesn't really he sees Inaluki as a sorrow, as a sad figure, and he feels sorry for Inaluki, and he's able to let go of this hatred, and because of that, Inaluki's not able to use him as a vessel, and therefore Inaluki perishes, as he has no further connection to this world. So all that happens, and like I said, really I liked how Miriamel was the one that got the final blow in there at the end. I thought it would be Simon, but she was the one that severed that connection. And it was really Simon's battle with himself that was able to, him growing as a character, was able to reject this evil presence. So all that battle, internal conflict within a character was great stuff here at the end. I think that's really most of the spoilers I wanted to touch on here. I definitely want to hear in the comments below. If you're watching this video, you have made it this far, you definitely have read this book and have thoughts about the events here, the characters. I want to know what you think in the comments below. Really just loved this book overall. And Kamaris coming back to sanity, that's something I didn't really talk about, but that was definitely one of my favorite moments in the book. But I feel like I've gone on long enough. So please in the comments below, let me know what you think about my takes or what your takes are on the book as a whole. That's about it. Thanks for watching and have a good one.